Hi everyone! So we decided to do our reading to learn strategy on found poetry. Found poetry is a type of poetry created by taking words, phrases, and sometimes even whole passages from other sources and reframing them by making changes in spacing and lines, or by adding or deleting text, thus creating a whole new meaning. There are several types of found poetry. The first is erasure, which is where poets take an existing source and erase the majority of the text, leaving behind select words and phrases that, when read in order, compose the poem. Here are a few examples listed. The next is free-form excerpting and remixing, which is where poets excerpt words and phrases from their source text and rearrange them in any manner they choose. The next type is cento, which is where poets unite lines from other authors' writings into a new poem. The original lines remain intact, and the main intervention comes in arrangement and form. And the next type is cut up, which is where poets physically cut or tear up a text into words and phrases, then create a poem by rearranging those strips. Arrangement may be intentional or haphazard.
Now that you have learned about the different types of found poetry, you will now analyze a few different examples. Slide 4 is composed in the erasure style, and as you might have noticed, features the Declaration of Independence. Apart from being a stellar example, it proves that this strategy can be implemented in various fields and be successful when applied. This reading strategy can be and should be utilized by history and speech teachers or any other field that can make this strategy work. One easy way to implement this strategy is to sit back, relax, and let student-centered learning occur. Give the students a text, explain how an erasure poem works, then instruct students to create an erasure poem which highlights the major points within the text. Alrighty then, we're going to move you along to the next slide. As you can see, there are 3 different picture poems. All 3 of these pictures were pulled from Google and are examples of student-found poetry. Pictures 1 and 2 were done in the erasure style that we covered in slides 3 and 4. However, picture 3 is an example of a free-form excerpting and remixing type of found poetry. Notice how the text is clearly a hodgepodge of various texts. This type of found poetry still has meaning. It's just that the meaning is dictated by the student's narrative instead of authorial intent. The student can create whatever found poetry they desire, as long as it complies with the guidelines of that style. These pictures showcase how found poetry can be used within the classroom. Any of these picture poems could have been done in an art or English classroom. This is a fantastic strategy for allowing students to be creative within the classroom. When students have a control over their own learning, they are more likely to be motivated within the classroom. Furthermore, the strategy is a great tool for flushing out meaning of text, while it also acts as an assessment to measure student learning. While I might have mentioned specific fields that could benefit from this strategy, I must state if you can find a way to match this strategy to a standard that relates to your field, use it and have fun.
Is centered around creativity. Students are tasked with recreating an existing piece of writing to fit their own interpretation. To do this, students can rearrange the stanzas of a poem they find or eliminate certain lines and write their own. The practice of found poetry is to reinforce the idea that every interpretation of the poem is valid. Students' literacy within reading and comprehending a text is then strengthened as they explore other mediums of writing. For our presentation, the class is first shown an image of a found poem that has lines of text blacked out, and then they are asked to read this silently to themselves. Then, they are shown the same poem in its original format, displaying all of its lines for comparison. Finally, the class is asked to consider why those particular lines were omitted from the original poem and how the lines of the found poem work to display new meaning. This is considered the warm-up exercise to the lesson, and an example is found on page 3 of our lesson plan. Throughout the found poetry exercise, students should be reminded that they are not rearranging poems randomly. Rather, they are weighing their choices of rearrangement or omission in order to reflect their own understanding. It is vital that students reflect on their individualized reactions to the poem so they can work toward actually representing it. For our presentation, the class is provided with a single poem. After reading, they are asked to identify what they think the theme of the poem might be. By continuously referencing this theme, students are then asked to individually underline key words or phrases that relate to the chosen theme. Then, they are asked to trade papers with their neighbors. Students now must use the underlined keywords and phrases chosen by their neighbor in order to create their own found poem. This will challenge them to compare their reading of a text with somebody else's in order to visualize comprehension. An example of this is found on page 2 of our lesson plan. The found poetry exercise can begin to come to a close through sharing of work and reflection. It is equally important for students to both present their work and hear the work of others in order to gain a variety of perspectives. Found poetry challenges comprehension at this stage as well, as students should feel comfortable justifying their comprehensions of a text after this lesson. For our presentation, students are asked about the work of their neighbor and how their key words compare to their own. This reflection is then followed by whole class discussion, guided by questions offered from the teacher. The discussion portion of this lesson serves as an informal assessment of their understanding of reading comprehension. The guiding questions can be found under the wrap-up portion on page 1 of our lesson plan.
Okay, I want to go over the diversity of student learning for found poetry, and this is going to be on slide 9. So the big thing that found poetry offers is a diversity for student learning. So found poetry can be crafted from any existing document. This can be used for any student in the classroom. Your lowest level learners will be just as challenged as the highest level, and vice versa. So everyone in the classroom will have a challenging assignment that is going to benefit them, because it can really be tailored to what each individual student needs. Ways to adapt it to kind of meet the lower level readers in a classroom might be things such as picking words for students to use, focusing on a theme or words that you think they need help with. So focusing on these words in found poetry will actually help them understand, and they will be more likely to use them in other assignments. Along with this, found poetry also benefits students who are English language learners. And in my experience, it can be a very difficult transition for many of these students to learn in a classroom that's predominantly English when they speak another language. And found poetry actually bridges this gap in a way, because they can use words that already exist to create something new. They're not creating something from a brand new idea. They're using the materials that are given to them to create something new. Often in a school that I work in with students who speak multiple languages and are in that transition of learning and working in a predominantly English classroom, have translation papers with Spanish or any of the other languages that they might be learning, and they also have an English copy, so that way they can read both, and any time they might have a challenge in the English reading, that they can go to their predominant language. For this, what could be helpful for these types of students would be to have them do it in their native language first, and then attempt to translate it into the English. You might have to shorten the assignment for them because it will take more time doing that, but this can be very good for these students because they're not expected to create something new or come up with words that they might not know. They're learning more words, which goes into the next point, is that students become exposed to a larger vocabulary. Often students will reuse many of the same words in their own vocabulary, but when creating with found poetry, the words are already given, so they have to use what is there, and when used efficiently, this can actually really stretch and challenge learners, because they can be exposed to words that they may have never seen before, or words that they might be struggling with that are specifically chosen for them to really focus on in this assignment. So that is something that can be definitely beneficial for these students, is the exposure to the larger vocabulary. Moving on to the limitations of this assignment, or this strategy, I should say, is the copyright laws. A lot of these, although not going to be a major issue for learning in the classroom and that, but the text that is being used has already been published and sold, and there's copyright laws that won't become a major play, but they need to be made aware of. It's also not practical for complex material. An example of this might be summarizing science textbook chapters. It's very difficult to use this strategy in a very straightforward material of larger complexity, because you're really breaking it down and creating something from this. Now, it might be used as a strategy for smaller ideas within a chapter. Maybe if in that science there is something about the water cycle that you might use, and students can break things down to put together a found poetry or a found poem about the water cycle. But for larger, more complex ideas, this strategy isn't practical for that. So really, when focusing and using this strategy, it is better to use it for simpler material and things that students might be able to focus on one theme or topic. Another limitation is students may not understand specific vocabulary. While it's good to challenge them, there is a line that needs to be set for how far these students will be pushed, because for some in the class, their reading level is going to be much higher. They're going to be able to really cruise through creating something like this, but a lot of other students are going to need support and other assistance into getting to that point, because they don't understand the vocabulary of what's given to them. Because they're expected to use the vocabulary that's given to them, it's difficult for them to, should I say, put it in their own words, which is something that they might do for other strategies or assignments on their part. Along with this, going back to the ELL learners, or the English secondary learners, it's vocabulary that they might not be exposed to, because their vocabulary is, or could be, much smaller or limited, because they themselves are just learning the language. So it could be difficult for them to do this assignment. It might need a lot more assistance, scaffolding, because they're not going to understand certain words. So going with this, it could go back to picking specific words and defining them first as a way to assist them and support them in that way, whereas other students might not need it. So there will be adaptations to this strategy or assignment that you use, but overall, as long as you are aware of what you're using it for and the planning, and that is correct, then this strategy can be used very effectively in the classroom.